bum, bum. This is The Newsagents.
It's Jon.
It's Lewis, and welcome to our second ever Newsagents Live Q&A, which is streaming right now on Global Player on YouTube. We have been asking for your questions for the last 24 hours on the smorgasbord of political stories, which is currently out there. Many of you have sent them to us. We're going to try and get through as many of them as we can. But as well, if you are coming to this for the first time and would like to ask a question, then leave it in the comments and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible as well.
Obviously, the first time we did the live stream, the main debating point of that show was Lewis's jumper, which had a B on it, where the self-effacing, modest, shy, retiring Lewis Goodall said, "A grade I never got at school."
Not strictly true, actually. I did get one for graphics. Mr. Fergus will attest to
it. But otherwise, it was straight A's all the way.
Yeah, but to be honest, even that was a bit of a lie, because it was the new Labour years, and you could just basically do it nearly all as coursework. So it was a complete fabrication, really.
But anyway, we haven't had many questions in, but there have been comments about what you'll be wearing today, and I think people disappointed that you won't be wearing a beret. Apparently,
a beret and a polo net jumper. I did think, if next time we do it, if people have requests, I'm extremely happy to do it. So come in as a kind of mid-1970s Doctor Who. I'm very happy to do that.
Please. Anyway, very nice beige summery looking suit from Mr. Goodall that he's sporting today. Right, let's get cracking. Let's hear a voice note.
Hi newsagents, this is Luke from South London. My question related to something which Jon said in an episode earlier this week around how politically Keir Starmer would not get up on stage and congratulate Rishi Sunak or the Conservatives for implementing policies which are starting to bring net migration down. And I thought that was really interesting, because politically I would say it would be better for the Prime Minister or another politician to stand up and give credit where credit's due. I think the great British public would respect that if a senior politician stood up and said, actually, do you know what? The Tories did make a mess of it over the last 14 years, but on this particular thing, they got it right. And we owe them credit for that. Now, I wouldn't say that the Tories got an awful lot right over the 14 years that they had in government, and that's coming from someone who voted Conservative. But I'm just interested in what your opinion is on that. Would you say that actually it might be a good thing from time to time for a senior politician to stand up and give credit to their predecessors for a good policy?
Such an interesting question. I suppose the reason I said it was the way the media landscape works when you're in government. That if Keir Starmer was to have stood up and said, "Thank you, Rishi, it's all down to you," that is the Daily Mail headline, and it will be used as a cudgel with which you beat Keir Starmer over the head. It's like, I agree with you in so many ways in the premise of your question. I think it's a good thing when politicians have screwed up and they say they're sorry. But if you say you're sorry more than once, then you just kind of get the reputation for being slightly hapless and hopeless, and they don't do it. Go on, what do you think?
Well, I have a quite unfashionable view, which is, when people always say in Prime Minister's questions, "Oh, it's too adversarial and it's too combative." I don't think it's adversarial enough. Or at least it's exactly adversarial.
You want fist fights?
Well, not quite, but I think there is something important about politics representing. Politics, the essence of politics is division, right? It's division, and that's not to say, and especially in our system, and obviously in systems, and that's the thing I think about recognising the achievements of your opponents. In our system in particular, it's difficult. In a more continental system, which is more consensual and where there is more coalition, then it is more typical that you would have a slightly kind of less fevered kind of political culture. But ours doesn't do that, for good or ill. I actually think largely for good. I think where you sort of see it usually is when politicians it's a backhanded compliment, right? So a great example is David Cameron, in the years when Tony Blair was rolling out academies, right, when academies being releasing schools from local authority control, Cameron would almost tease Blair, compliment him in the House of Commons and go, we're very much in favour of this. And indeed, if you want to go further, you can afford to be as bold as you want to be, because he knew that it was controversial on the Labour benches and was basically offering him votes to go even further. So normally in our system, it's because there is some advantage or utility to the opposition doing it in some way.
Yeah, I was going to make a different Cameron point on that, because actually I think that Cameron did admire Tony Blair hugely,
Yes.
and the Tories had a problem of detoxifying the brand.
And they clapped him on his final PMQs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so what you did was, they'd seen that Labour had won 3 consecutive general elections, and they thought, well, we need some of the secret sauce that Blair's got. So don't make yourself thinking that Blair is this ridiculous total failure. You embrace a bit of it. And Blair did exactly the same in the 1990s with Thatcher, where he was saying she didn't get everything wrong. That people have
Starmer
been able
did it as well.
You've been able to buy your council houses, and people have enjoyed that, and there's wider share ownership now, and that's So Tony Blair did embrace those things, but it was part of a political strategy to make him broaden out the appeal of the Labour Party, just as Cameron in 2010 was trying to broaden out the Conservatives' appeal to a larger audience.
If you were to go directly to Luke's question about what Starmer theoretically could praise the Conservatives about, one area that is generally considered, although not within the Labour parts of the Labour Party for sure, that things on many objective measures did improve, was school attainment, and it was a sort of evolution of the Blair period and the sort of Blair era reforms. If Starmer had wanted to, he probably wouldn't do it now because the politics had moved on. But if Starmer had wanted to kind of do a kind of Cameron type thing where he wanted to praise, sort of damn the Tories with faint praise, he could have done it on something that almost nobody talks about now, that was actually a real success, but the Tories don't want to talk about it because the politics has moved on, which was what happened in wind power. Actually, there were real successes in the Tory period on offshore wind in particular, real expansion in the UK's energy supply in that way. But the Tories don't want to talk about that now. It's one of the few real proper domestic policy successes they had in their 14 years. And they do not want to touch it because they do not want to be associated, ironically enough now, with anything to do with a net zero agenda.
I suspect we're going to come on to talk about a little bit later on about assisted dying. Now, that debate wasn't adversarial.
Look at that. He's seen the question. Now he just looks like he's just kind of... He knows what questions are coming, and now he just wants to look like he's got a sort of the power of premonition.
I can see the future, and if you want tomorrow's lottery numbers, I'll give you those as well. But no, there are times when you have debate which is not adversarial. And I think that when the Commons does come together, it's actually rather majestic when there is a kind of unity, whether it be a foreign policy question, which is the more common area where you will have kind of the party standing together.
Suspicious when they all sort of get
on Ukraine.
Not Ukraine.
I think
not Ukraine. No,
I think there are times when you think, God, the British Parliament is speaking with one voice and a moral clarity, and I think that is good. And I think
although it can be where bad consensuses form as well.
Yes, when everyone starts thinking that there is only one. There's a very interesting debate on. In Congress about Congress at the moment in the States on China, where everyone's united that you've got to be tough with China, and they are trying to take over the world. And actually there's a lot of counterintuitive stuff which says, well, actually maybe we ought to be they ought to be engaging with China more graciously and generously, and that China is not trying to do what America says it's trying to do, where you get that false consensus building. But I think that praising your opponent, used cleverly, is brilliant. But as a general rule,
James Cleverly.
Well, not James Cleverly necessarily. No, just that word cleverly.
All right. We've got a question here from Christian Alcorn, who says, "Hi guys, how much of an impact on the recent surge in Reform's popularity is down to the excessive media coverage, screen and airtime they get? Any firefighter would tell you that to put out a fire, you starve it of oxygen, yet our media seem incessant on giving them as much coverage as possible. I appreciate that, ironically, this question is giving them further oxygen. Thanks, Christian." And I don't know about you, John, but this is the question, certainly in my social media timeline. This is basically the question that you get all the time, particularly from listeners, viewers of a particular kind of political bent, which is, why are you, the media, legitimising reform in the way that you are? You're the one who have created him. The classic thing that people always say is Nigel Farage has been on Question Time X number of times in the last few decade or whatever it is, and therefore that sort of accounts for his right. Do you get that a lot?
So I don't like the phrase legitimising them, because I think they are legitimate. They're a democratic political party committed to achieving their ends by democratic means. So I don't think they are a kind of quasi-terrorist group that we're sanitising. You might not like their politics. I think where there is a point on this is that Reform and Farage are indistinguishable And you and I spoke, we sat in this studio, I think exactly 2 weeks ago after the local council elections and talked about whether there would be more scrutiny now and more accountability for reform now that they've got all these councils and mayoralties and the like. I think that if you are one of the big TV networks, kind of BBC or ITV or Sky, I'd be saying, no, we don't want Nigel Farage. We want other members of Reform, because I think that, we know that Farage is a brilliant media performer, but if it is a party that has a bench of other people as well, then I think that they ought to be tested as well, because I think that you will see people who aren't as good as Farage and aren't as convincing as Farage, and then you will get the scrutiny to see whether this really adds up as a proper political party.
Yeah, I am highly suspicious of the idea that the media can be solely held accountable to blame for the rise of Farage or indeed any populist force. I think that that's a cop-out. I think it's an easy thing to cling to for liberals and for liberalism to think that if only were it not for the media, that this guy wouldn't exist or that these political ideas would not exist. There is probably an element of truth that there have been times. I mean, look, Farage has definitely got a very supportive media. That is true of all right-wing sort of populist type forces. It's always true that certainly the press, at least, is highly sympathetic potentially to a force like that and has long been. And the press, we know, is very, very powerful in determining what the kind of national agenda is, what the BBC does, what the broadcasters do, and so on. So that is certainly true, and that's been true of all sorts of different political figures on the right. But when people say things like Nigel Farage is on Question Time again, I'm sorry, is that true of Donald Trump? Is that true of Marine Le Pen? Is that true of the suite of populist forces, sometimes occasionally on the left, but certainly on the right, that we have seen throughout the West over the last decade? Georgia Maloney, you could just go on and on and on. And I think the problem is far more fundamental, which is that liberalism, progressivism, the anti-nativist, populist conservative, whatever you want to call it, side of politics has not got its act together. It does not have and has not found the arguments to combat people like Farage in an effective way, and they don't have the communicators to do it either. So what they are doing in the media case, in blaming the media, is quite literally to blame the messenger. Look at the political situation that we've got at the moment. We talked about it on that show, John, that you just referenced. What is one of the fundamentals of British politics right now? It's that Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch, to a greater or lesser extent, are pointing at Nigel Farage and going, Nigel Farage is right, please don't vote for him. That is not a media problem. That's a political problem. And the media is simply reflecting the fact that in terms of the battle of ideas, which is currently being fought in politics, quite often the other side just isn't turning up, or at least it isn't turning up in a convincing and compelling way. So Farage is sweeping the board, and forces like him are doing so.
And look, the grievances exist. The grievances about illegal immigration, say, small boats arriving, exist independently of Farage. They may be being exploited in a more successful way politically and electorally by Farage. But to say to the British people, well, you're just wrong about that. And that is where liberalism will really fail. And you saw it with the Democratic Party in the presidential election, where they kind of were trying to pretend that it wasn't a huge problem what was happening at the southern border of the United States of America. And that way lies political ruin. And so I think that you've got to accept that there are going to be parties. You can't just go around saying, well, I know you've got this grievance, love, but you're wrong. That's no way to have a political debate. Those grievances exist, and they are finding their outlet in support for the Reform Party. And the media just can't have a media blackout and say, well, actually, because it offends our liberalism, we're not going to cover you as a political party. Also, that would be suicidal.
Also, it presupposes, the question almost also presupposes a media environment which is 20 or 30 years old.
Yeah, exactly.
Which still basically orbits around... It's not the Sun what
won it.
Yeah, which still orbits around 6 or 7 national newspapers, the BBC plus a few other broadcasters. As we know, we are in the studio right now. It is a testament to it. That world no longer exists. It is fragmented. It is polarised. The number of media sources are increasing all the time. And this is the other thing about the populists, for want of a better expression, or Farage in particular. Where is Farage? Very, very popular. Where is Farage actually very gifted? And certainly the team around him are very gifted. TikTok, all the big new, all the digital media platforms.
Exactly.
And okay, something like Twitter has moved in his direction. But this is the challenge for liberalism, for progressivism, for the left, for the other side of politics. It's to meet that challenge, to have communicators and a strategy and a set of ideas which fight and combat those ideas and those people. That is the essence of politics. And again, to simply focus on the media, I think it basically is clinging to a series of fictions which are comforting but ultimately hollow.
And also, look, just, kind of use the American example. So ABC News World Tonight on 6:30 every evening on the east coast of America, and it goes across the whole country with David Muir, probably has total a couple of million viewers. Elon Musk on Twitter has 250 million followers, which is more powerful.
Yeah.
So I think the idea that if only the media didn't cover Nigel Farage as much, he would go away, I think is just foolish thinking and quite dangerous as well.
I think what is true is to say that there is a lot of, in this traditional media, there is a lot of sloppy journalism in terms of sort of narratives which take hold. So, for example, the idea, you would think right now, and it's largely a vibes thing, you would think right now that the way that things are being covered and the way things are talked about is as if, the average, that basically there is almost one view in the country outside of London and the big cities, right? And it's basically, a Faragist reform kind of view that everybody is of the same mind. That is not true. Politics is really complicated. We saw this happen in the post-Brexit period, which was the idea, for example, that the whole of the north of England or the whole of the Midlands, that was kind of leave land, and then the south of England and whatever is sort of remain land and a sort of urban bourgeois. No, the politics is so much more fragmented than that. Actually, the Brexit heartlands, right, well, as much as anything, were places like Hampshire or the sort of places in the south of England, or Devon and so on, but it didn't fit kind of neat narrative. So I think what is true, look at the polling. Yes, Reform are between 25 and 30%. But actually, if you take what you broadly call the kind of centre-left vote and broadly the centre-right or right-wing vote, it's pretty 50-50 on terms of the parties. So the media definitely need to not fall into a series of tropes and traps, which is to sort of assume that all of politics outside of a few certain places is homogenous and everyone is of one view. The truth is British politics is way more complicated than that. But that is a challenge for the media and how it does things, not in terms of whether to include reform.
We've just had this question in from Joey in Manchester. And Joey, thanks for getting in touch. Hi, news agents. Based on current polling, if Labour were to replace Keir Starmer within the next year, maybe after the next batch of council elections, who do you think would be most likely to replace him?
Great question.
Yeah, and I've got to read the last sentence of this. Love everything you do. Joey from Manchester.
Oh, bless. Thank you, Joey. And remember, if you've got a question like Joey, then do just put it in the comment box and the team will give them to
Although
us.
you don't have to say love everything you do.
Well, it would help. Nice. It would help. It would certainly get you to the top of the pile, I think it's fair to say. And you could be even nicer. I think it's a great question, a really interesting question, and actually is one that is put and is discussed within the Labour Party more than you might think.
Yeah.
And the thing is what's interesting is that I think, again, to take it back to the media, I think that the people who are most likely to win are not the people that you might think from the way that the media treat them. So, for example, we do know who is probably the media's favourite cabinet minister. Who would you say? Wes Streeting. Where do you think Wes Streeting comes in terms of popularity among Labour Party members who are ultimately the ones who are going to make the decision?
Yeah.
Not nearly as high up, pretty low down by comparison to, say, Angela Rayner, by comparison to Ed Miliband, the figure who, according to the media at least anyway, could well be on the way out and all of this sort of stuff. The truth is there is, as ever, a big disconnect between the sort of Labour Party leader that much of the media might like and the median Labour Party figure that the Labour Party membership might approve of. Now, that's not to say that we're in a kind of Corbynite period where it would necessarily be a figure from the hard left. But certainly right now, Keir Starmer under a bus tomorrow, I would be amazed if it wasn't Angela Rayner, particularly given as well that the Labour Party would be looking for a figure that they felt would be able to oppose Nigel Farage and connect with and speak to voters in reform-oriented seats. And whether it's true or not that she'd be able to do it, I think the narrative would be that Rayner would.
I want to bring in another question. This is from Francis Guinham, which just because it kind of flows really into it, which is, hi news agents, Keir Starmer is still regarded by commentators and the media as a man of integrity, despite the fact that it's blatantly obvious. He says whatever he has to or is told to in order to win an election. If Boris Johnson did this, he'd be rightly called a liar, but Starmer calls this pragmatic or ruthless and seems to get a point. At what point is pragmatic just code for dishonesty? What do you think of that? I think it's governing, isn't it? I think that there is an element, going back to Starmer, and relating it to the question from Joey, which is, if Starmer is going because he's hit by a London bus, then I think there will be a chance that it could even be Rachel Reeves as the continuity candidate. If it comes after absolutely appalling, hammering at the local council elections, then obviously the party then thinks we've got to go in a different direction. But I don't know about... I mean, look, Starmer's made this big speech on immigration this week. I was kind of with a couple of business leaders who'd seen Starmer and were over from America, and they said they really were impressed by him, and that what he says in public is what he says in private. There is no difference in the messaging. But I mean, obviously, he has been on quite a journey since he was elected leader in 2019. But maybe he had to, given the power that kind of momentum still had in the Labour Party.
Yeah, look, I think that. Look, the history of politics is littered with people who have tacked to their parties left or right and then tacked away from it once they actually get the job, right? That's not that unusual. Although I do think that the space that he has put himself from where he was and where he now is large by comparison to even some of those figures.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember being in his launch in Manchester. This is like January 2020, so just pre-COVID, or before we kind of knew COVID was coming. And his line then was, let's not ditch the last Labour government, which was obviously a rebuke to Corbynism. But let's not ditch the best of the last 4 years, which I suppose technically you could say, well, he didn't think there was anything. But I mean, that was the thing. I remember him referring to Jeremy Corbyn as an ally and a friend. All of this sort of stuff. And actually, and I do think it has been a problem in terms of the legitimacy of his project. If you look at other successful leaders of the opposition who've gone into office, so let's take, if you think about Tony Blair, David Cameron, they were quite frank with their parties about the direction they intended to go in. That is different to Starmer. Starmer told his party and the country one thing and then moved in a very different direction. And you could argue that same phenomenon has even happened in government, right? He said certain things in opposition just before the election, which he's now tacked away from. Again, oppose it to Cameron and Osborne. Whatever you think about austerity, they were quite clear with the public that that's what they intended to do. So I think that there has been I think the degree to which Starmer has shifted is unusual. I do think, to be fair, something happened to him in particular in 2021. I'm not sure he always intended to go as hard as he did and go as sort of right as he has. I mean, you could argue some of that is circumstances and kind of the wider geopolitical world that he's in. But I do think, if you cast your minds back to the Hartlepool by-election in 2021, those disastrous local elections, what happens? Starmer, whose shadow cabinet at that point was quite mixed in terms of the makeup of the party, lots of figures from the soft left. He dumps his shadow chancellor Annalise Dodds. He brings Rachel Reeves in. He brings a lot of figures from the kind of quote-unquote Blairite right. Morgan McSweeney comes in, takes a leading role. And then that's where the shift happens. And I think at that point, he basically decided that he had to abandon whatever particular soft leftish instincts he might have had and went all in with a cadre of political figures who had quite different instincts. And then they won. And so from Starmer's point of view, it kind of worked. And now he's very much listening to them, Morgan McSweeney principally of all.
But I think that is, a central truth of politics is that party activists, whether in the Conservative Party or whether in the Labour Party, are far further to the left or the right, of course, in the Labour Party and the left, the Conservative Party to the right, than the average voter. And, so,
it's like our team. Our team are a bunch of extremist radicals, of course,
exactly.
firebrands.
You've got to sort of, okay, I've got to win. You were talking about that it would be the Labour Party membership who would be voting if Starmer falls.
Yeah.
So, you've got to have to tack to the left. I suppose the only person who I think who didn't do that was Blair. Who kind of, but
that's what
Labour,
I'm saying. Yeah,
but Labour had lost
in a different place.
79, 83, 87, 92.
Same with Cameron in 05.
Yeah, the party just wanted to win. And so Blair was able to stand up and say to them, look, guys, we're not going to win kind of unless we accept that trade union laws have been changed and that people have bought their council. We're not going to reverse those policies. No. And I think that he did that, and I think that, and Cameron did the same.
Well, Starmer, I suppose the biggest difference, and again, another difference with all that, is that Starmer, like Cameron and Blair, Starmer ran, the reason he won that election was that he ran as the unity candidate. that he was basically in the middle of.
Yeah.
He was not the Corbynite candidate, that was Rebecca Long-Bailey. He was not the sort of party of the openly running as the party of the candidates right. He was the unity. That was the line. Let's not ditch the best of the last 5 years, of the last Labour government. And obviously, pretty early on, he started to change tack. And I don't think, actually, from anyone who had observed him that closely in terms of his politics before that, I'm not sure that anyone was that surprised. But anyone who wasn't watching it very closely, I think, would be and still feel wounded by it.
Yeah, and this kind of goes into Marie's question on Blue Sky. Were traditional Labour voters hoodwinked by Keir Starmer? Was he always heading towards the right and we didn't see it? Or is he being woefully ill-advised? I don't know whether he's being woefully... I mean, he's woefully ill-advised if you're from the left and you think that he's going in that. But I think that is the direction that Starmer has set this government, and he believes that this is where it's closest to the British people.
Well, I mean, just on this, and it links to all of these questions. I was talking to quite a senior civil servant the other day, and they said, it is unusual for us to have a Prime Minister who doesn't have politics.
Yeah.
And that is, I mean, it's a bit of a trope about Starmer, and I don't think it's sort of completely accurate. No one at that level has no politics. But I do think that he wears any ideology he has, by comparison to any post-war Prime Minister I can think of, remarkably lightly. I think the things about which he's genuinely enthused and passionate and where the line is for him, I think are quite... I think they're largely about the law, actually. I can't imagine, for example, him ever agreeing to withdraw from the ECHR, because that would offend him as a sort of the lawyer within him. It would offend him. The idea of sort of breaking the rules in that way. That sort of stuff, yes, he's a rules-based politician rather than an ideology-based politician. And I think that's one of the reasons... Because he embodies rules in those way, and that's the things that he always, and propriety. I think that's one of the things that helps him in terms of not being accused of being a liar and so on, because he exudes, unlike Boris Johnson, because he exudes that sort of propriety. So even when he's being quite disingenuous, arguably even dishonest, actually it's one of those things that weirdly he kind of gets bandwidth for, or he gets allowances for, at least from some people.
I think you saw both aspects of that, his loyalness and his kind of lack of ideological baggage, to both good and ill, with the Chagos Islands deal, which is, the legal advice was you've got to give them back. Oh, well, if that's the legal advice and and we'll be in breach of international law, then that's clearly what we have to do. Okay, tick. But it was, probably dumb politics to be doing that at the time, given the backlash there has been to it and the potential for falling out with the United States over it. So, it can work both ways to your advantage and disadvantage.
So, John, the good news is that the former president, indeed former vice president, second president of the United States, John Adams, appears to be a fan of the show, because he sent a question in. Yes, his rotundity, as he used to be nicknamed back in the day. Why do you think, says President Adams, why do you think that Putin chose not to travel to Turkey for talks with Zelensky? Pressure is clearly coming from Trump, but nothing is changing. What do you think, if anything, will force Putin into peace talks? Well, perhaps a word from a former president. I mean, who knows?
Well, I look, Donald Trump spoke a truth yesterday on Air Force One when he said there's no progress going to be made until, we sit down together. Putin's point of view, I suspect, is if I sit down with Donald Trump, I'll be able to get whatever I want because I've played him brilliantly every time there's ever been an encounter. And you think of the encounters with Steve Witkoff had with Putin when he went to Moscow. And, Putin apparently said, I went to church and prayed for Donald Trump after the assassination attempt in Pennsylvania. Yeah, really? And and this is this lovely portrait we've done for you to give to Donald Trump of course, Donald Trump. And you just think, my God, the Russians play him like a fiddle. So, yes, Donald Trump is probably right that progress will be required and only happen when Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin sit down together, just the two of them. But by God, I wouldn't want to be Vladimir Zelensky when that happens and it's carved up without him being part of it.
I think it was always going to be. I mean, we've spent part of this week, haven't we, talking about whether we thought Putin would go, and even whether we thought if it was going to happen, we should take the show to Istanbul. It could be an absolutely massive moment. Think of those pictures between the three of them meeting Trump, Zelensky, Putin, and we all sort of went back and forth and couldn't quite believe, any of us, it was going to happen, which in the end turned out to be right. A rare bit of accurate news judgment there from the news agents, but I think the reason that Putin would always would always have struggled to do it is is actually a domestic political one, right? Which is that he has spent the last 2-3 years before that telling the Russian public that Zelensky's government is a neo-fascist, illegitimate, Western stooge government that needs to be removed, needs to be destroyed. That's why he has a maximalist view of the whole thing, right? That's why he can't just accept these territorial things. He needs Zelensky to go. So to stand on a platform or a stage or whatever it happened to be, even in a frosty way, with Zelensky, even if Trump had been there, and there was talk that maybe he could say, well, he went to see Trump rather than Zelensky, but that would have been required, I think was always going to be very difficult, because then suddenly, Russian population, yes, many of whom have been brainwashed by the Putin regime on these matters, but nonetheless could legitimately ask the question, well, given that he is all of those things, why on earth is our president going to meet the guy?
Look, it is perfectly possible to see a ceasefire where the conflict gets frozen. But a peace deal is either going to require Volodymyr Zelensky to say, yeah, Crimea, it's yours, keep it. We recognise that everything you've taken is ours, and yeah, we'll become a vassal state, we'll do whatever, we'll be in Russia's orbit, we'll do whatever you say. Or it's going to require Vladimir Putin to say, yeah, I shouldn't have taken all that land. Yeah, I'm going to give some of it back. It's never going to happen.
And what the other thing is that I think that I actually think that I think this war is going to go on for a long time. I really do. And I think
it could be like the Korean War, where it gets frozen and nothing is resolved. And
maybe, yeah. But I think that one of the reasons is that I think it is underappreciated here, obviously, because so few of us can go now and there can be so little reporting from there. But the extent to which the Russian economy is now completely militarized, right? The extent to which, actually, if Putin said, okay, well, let's stop the fighting tomorrow, half the Russian economy grinds to a halt. Suddenly Putin's got a massive unemployment problem on his hands. Suddenly he's got a massive deflationary problem on his hands. And actually and as well, you've got to find a sort of neat way out of basically saying, like I say, to the population, that the reason that we've sent, so many thousands upon thousands upon thousands of our young men into the meat grinder of this war, that it's got to be worth it for some reason, and it's got to be worth it partly to remove this neo-fascist government, as I say, which is on our doorstep. So I think that the exit strategy for Putin, just domestically, we always focus on whether he's saving face, on the sort of international position, but actually domestically, even though his regime is strong, domestically is really difficult and underplayed as an issue. Anyway, I hope that solves answers your question, President Adams. Give our regards to John Quincy. I've often thought.
Okay. Here we go. Here we go. We're going back to early 19th century US politics.
What do you think about this as an idea, right? If I ever have a son, calling him something I've talked about with my wife, calling him Lewis Quincy Goodall. What do you reckon about that? Is that okay? Is that okay? Do you think he'll be okay at school? Do you think that's going to be?
Well, I think there are worse names. I mean, I think that
Quincy. You think there are worse? Quincy's quite bad, isn't it?
Elon Musk's son.
What? Oh, X. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to go to school with that as a name. An 11-year-old kid going to secondary school. Oh, hi, my name's X. Really?
And our apologies to any of our listeners who are called Quincy. And given we know our listeners are like, I reckon there are at least a couple.
Quincy Adams was also a great musician, so
Okay. JQA. Well, there you go. JQA.
Okay.
Frankie Gerard on X asked, the assisted dying bill is one of the most important pieces of legislation Parliament will ever consider. Indeed, I can see out the corner of our eye, or at least it was on a few minutes ago, Parliament is discussing it as we speak right now. The Royal College of Psychiatrists, the Royal College of Physicians, palliative doctors, disabilities charities and vulnerable patient groups have now come to oppose it. What should be done?
So,
how would you vote, John, if you were an MP?
So my instinct is to support it. That I think that people who have a terminal illness, who've only got one path, and it's going to be grim and miserable, that providing they have their cognitive abilities around them to make a judgment, should be able to do so. But I do think of this, and I'm sure I'll get criticised for saying it, but I think of it as sort of like capital punishment, why I could never support capital punishment. Because if you do make a mistake, then someone has been condemned to death, which shouldn't have been. And I just worry that for all the safeguards that you could put in place, I think it's a really finely balanced argument, and I struggle with it, and I go backwards and forwards. But I suppose if there was a time when someone had been coerced or whatever by the family into kind of agreeing to assisted dying, and that person didn't really want to, I think that's a pretty bad place for a society to be. So on the finest of margins, I would probably vote against, unless I could be 100% assured that every safeguard was in place, would be followed and wouldn't go wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? And it's something about which people feel very passionately one way or the other, which you have to respect. I mean, just for the record, of course, there are other medical groups that certainly many of the Royal Colleges have decided to be neutral about it, because often their opinion of those colleges, their members, GPs, whatever it happens to be, are themselves very split about it. And of course, no doctor would be compelled, I think, under the current legislation at least, to take part in it, and if they didn't want to. I mean, again, my instinct, probably stronger than yours, John, I think, is to support it. I think it's a matter of liberalism, and I think that I'm not sure why the state has the right to have that level of control. And this is over when and how my life ends. Of course, you can say, well, the state will be helping you, so that's the difference. But then on the other hand, I see a lot of parallels with the abortion question. I'm not sure. I saw an MP, a Labour MP, earlier today, talk about, which is basically the heart of this, right? Which do you focus on? Which matters more? Which do you choose to prioritise? Is it individual liberty and the individual right to choose over something? Or is it solidarity with people about whom or for whom this right may be abused? Again, and I can totally understand why someone, particularly from the Labour tradition, might, by the way, with that focus on solidarity and collectivism, might come down on the latter. That said, again, why wouldn't you employ that argument about abortion? Because abortion could be coerced. Someone could be coerced to have an abortion. Someone that can be abused, that can be misused. Indeed, that's one of the arguments that people who are against abortion in the United States sometimes use. But just because a right can be misused, or it can be misapplied, or there can even be coercion involved, and let's remember, of course, this legislation only applies to people with 6 months or less to live, not just to anybody, it doesn't mean that you don't allow that right to be exercised by the greater body of the population. So I can understand why people would come down on a different side of the argument. I just think that as we get older, I worry that some of this is about taboo about death. I think we have a big taboo in our society about death and talking about end of life. I think often we find it squeamish. I think we often find it difficult. I think there are often religious elements to it. And I think that ultimately we are in a society now where people are living longer, and we have to deal with more and more of these sort of terrible end of life conditions, and where people are in horrendous pain, no matter how good palliative care is. And I'm not sure why any of us have the right to say to someone that they can't choose the manner in which they end their life. I mean, people say this is a matter of life and death. I happen to agree with Kim Ledbeat, who says, no, this is a matter of death and death. It's just about a matter of when that death comes.
Yeah, I mean, it's an absolutely fascinating debate.
It is.
It's a difficult debate.
And there's no right answer. It's
I know.
It is a matter of what you prioritise.
Exactly. And you set out very articulately the principle of it. And, then you say, well, okay, that's the principle. I can see completely all of that. But then there are the practicalities.
Yeah.
Right. I've got one final question. I love this one. This is from Ted. Hi, newsagents. My question is, what's the weirdest place you've been to covering a story? From a loyal listener living down on the Kent coast.
Oh, lucky Ted.
It's lovely down there today.
I bet it is. Weirdest place you've ever been covering a story? It's a good question. Come on, you must have a few.
So, I've really agonised over this one. And I think, it was. I did an interview a few years ago, and it's quite important to say a few years ago, because it was with Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, the ruler of Dubai.
Right. Okay.
And before some pretty ugly allegations about him and coercive behaviour about his family had emerged.
Yes.
So I went to. So I met him in the centre of Dubai, and he insisted on driving me out to his sort of palace in the countryside, and he drove in this vehicle where he was not looking at the road at any point. He kept on looking at me, and I'm thinking, Julie, just please concentrate on the road. We go to this extraordinary Neverland place where there are giraffes running around, and he's imported all these kind of animals from Africa, and it's just the weirdest place you've ever seen. And we sit down, and he says, "This is where we will do the interview, and we're going to do the interview in 2 or 3 days' time." And there's this whopping great big fountain making a huge amount of noise. And I said, can we get the fountain turned off if we're doing the interview here? Because, frankly, the noise will get picked up on the microphones. It'll be terrible.
Yes.
And so my cameraman then, as a joke, says, oh, and also we've got the planes coming in to land at Dubai International Airport. Can you get them rerouted? We went and did the interview and not a plane came over our heads. And I thought, if you want a definition of absolute power, that was it. But it was just like sitting in this surreal place where
I'm sure it was because you requested it.
Yeah.
I'm sure it wasn't to do with the Sultan.
So that was pretty surreal place to be sitting there with these kind of wild animals that look like they've come from the Masai Mara, wandering around his estate.
And I was just thinking about, like, it's just something about journalism, right, which inevitably, depending on the kind of exigencies and weirdness of like the story, you end up in places that you would never go to in any other sector. So I was just thinking about, like, you know, I was thinking about, like, the Brexit years was a great example, right? Well, if obviously Brexit hadn't happened, there's no way that I would have ended up, like, working for Sky, like, literally stood on the Norwegian-Swedish border on some, like, border post, you know, like, sort of checking as the kind of various bits of cargo and freight go by and looking at these, you know, it's all of these sort of weird things. I remember there was a piece that was never ever put out, which, when I was at Sky during the election of 2017, which was, I did a whole night in Madame Florita's in Newcastle.
Sounds like a brothel.
Well, I think it may have had a... No. There was nothing like that. It was a nightclub.
Right.
And it was, I think now sadly gone, unfortunately. I think it's been replaced. But Madame Florita's was we basically decided to do it on the youth vote and whether it was going to go, like, really Corbynite. And so we spent the entire evening, literally from 10 till 4, you know, me in my suits, all these kind of, like, you know, 19, 20-year-old sort of students, because it was a student night, trying to ask them about, like, you know, how they were going to vote and so on. I mean, I knew it wasn't going to go that well when I asked this one girl. I said to her, how are you going to be voting in the election? She said, Labour. I said, oh, really? Labour? I said, why Labour? I said, because my mum does. I said, oh, right. I said, what do you think of Theresa May? She's like, I don't know who she is. And it never went out because the Sky bosses did feel, which is not true, they did feel that my piece to camera, which was a triumph at the end, by the way, it was an absolute triumph. We had the whole thing at the sort of top, this whole jigged up, and like, and then, you know, I just ended up getting surrounded by a sort of bevy of students who were very keen to be on television, and they felt I may have had a cocktail or two, which is not true. It just was hard not to look drunk when you're surrounded by people who are drunk. That was my line anyway. It never saw the light of day.
I'm now thinking when it was announced that Britain had won the 2012 Olympics, and I was in Paris, which was the main competitor for it. And I was in the outside the Hôtel de Ville, the sort of main town hall in the centre of Paris, and where obviously the French were pretty disappointed that they hadn't got it. And so I was doing kind of this BBC One special programme about it, and this guy comes up behind me and he says in a very French accent, "Why don't you F off? You are and you use the C word." And now all I could hear in my earpiece was, hand back to the studio, hand back to the studio. You know, you think, okay, this is not going very well. Anyway,
I think we should probably leave it there.
Shall we?
At the mention of Madame Florita's and the C word, I think we should probably leave it. Thank you so much for watching our second live Q&A. Hopefully we'll do a third one.
Yeah,
we'll
think
see
so.
what the people behind the glass, and it will of course all be available on YouTube on Global Player, where you can watch it again and again and again. And of course, if you're listening to this, well, you know already, you've listened to it as a podcast. So thanks to all of our viewers on Global Player and YouTube for tuning in to this special live edition of News Agents. As I say, this episode will be available and we will be back at our normal time of 5 p.m. on Monday.
We'll see you then. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.